Ashley closed her eyes, feeling the wind whip against her face as the Polaris RZR kicked up dust along the mountain trail. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air, and the view of Montana's towering peaks surrounding them in every direction made her feel wonderfully small. There was nothing out here but wilderness, the kind of escape both she and Brian had been craving for months. "Didn't I tell you this was the best idea ever?" Brian called over the growl of the engine. She smiled and gave him a thumbs up. "Yeah, you've said it easily 3 times today." Brian laughed, his eyes glinting behind the wraparound sunglasses he always wore when they went off-roading. His enthusiasm was infectious, and despite Ashley's lingering nerves, she couldn't help but be drawn into the excitement. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in a warm glow, though she knew that in the mountains daylight didn't last as long as it seemed. It was late fall, and the temperatures would start to drop as soon as the sun dipped behind the mountains. But for now, they were in their element, carving up miles of unmarked terrain on an impromptu adventure. They'd spent the first part of the day on more established trails, even taking a short hike to an alpine lake they'd heard about from a local guide. But it was Brian's idea to push further off the beaten path, where the chances of seeing wildlife were better and the thrill of being alone in the wilderness amplified. "Sure you're up for this?" Brian asked, glancing over at her as they rounded a bend that revealed a vast expanse of forest, rolling hills, and jagged rocks. "Of course," Ashley replied, leaning into him slightly as he turned the wheel to avoid a fallen tree branch. "We've got a couple hours of daylight left, easy," Brian said confidently. "I know you love it out here." She couldn't deny it. There was something intoxicating about the sheer isolation, the thrill of being away from the rest of the world. It was just her, Brian, and the endless wild. No responsibilities, no schedules, no stress. As they sped further up the mountainside, the trees thickened, the trail growing narrower. The crunch of pine needles under the tires became more pronounced as the dirt path transitioned to more rugged terrain. They had slowed their pace now, carefully navigating around large rocks and fallen branches. She glanced up at the sky and noted that the sunlight had begun to lose its intensity. The shadows cast by the trees were lengthening, swallowing the trail ahead. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested, trying to keep her voice light, but failing to hide the tinge of worry creeping in. Brian flashed her a quick grin. "Come on, we haven't even gotten to the good part yet. There's probably an amazing view just up ahead." Ashley bit her lip, wanting to trust his instincts. Brian had a knack for pushing boundaries, always finding the most incredible spots that weren't marked on any map. She knew history would repeat itself with something amazing, and so sighed away her insecurity in the moment. "Let's just check it out, and if there's nothing, we'll turn around," he promised. She nodded reluctantly, tightening her grip on the roll bar as the trail began to climb steeply. The RZR's engine growled in protest as it tackled the incline, the tires kicking up loose gravel. As they crested the hill, Ashley gasped. The view was indeed breathtaking. A photo-perfect view stretched out before them, lined with evergreens, with a small river winding its way through the valley floor. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun gave the scene an almost ethereal appearance. Brian let out a low whistle. "Now, that's what I'm talking about." For a moment, her tension melted away, replaced by awe at the sight before her. It was moments like these that made the risks worthwhile, the thrill of discovery, the reward of solitude in nature's untouched beauty. But just as she was about to relax, something in the distance caught her eye. "Brian, what's that?" He squinted, following her gaze to a shape in the middle of the trail up ahead. At first it looked like a boulder, but as they got closer, the shape began to move. Her breath caught in her throat. A moose. And not just any moose, a massive bull, standing right in the middle of the trail, its towering antlers stretching skyward like something from a prehistoric era. It was easily 8 feet tall at the shoulder, maybe more, and its sheer size made Ashley's stomach flutter. "Wow," Brian muttered. "That's one big guy." Ashley could only nod, her eyes locked on the animal. She'd seen moose before, but never one this close. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring at them as if sizing them up. Brian brought the razor to a stop, still a safe distance away. "Let's wait it out. They usually move off pretty quickly." But the moose didn't move. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. The bull stood still as a statue, its dark eyes watching them, its breath coming in slow, visible puffs in the cooling air. Brian tapped the steering wheel impatiently. "Come on, buddy, we've got places to go." Ashley felt a knot tighten in her chest. Something was wrong. The moose wasn't behaving as expected. Instead of turning and walking away like most animals did when confronted with a vehicle, it seemed unfazed, and now it took a slow, deliberate step toward them. "Brian, I don't like this," she whispered. He shot her a reassuring smile. "Relax, it's probably just curious." But she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The moose took another step closer, its massive hooves thudding against the earth. Ashley's pulse quickened. They were still too far from the animal for it to be threatening, but the way it was approaching, slow and deliberate, sent a shiver down her spine. Then it stopped. For a long moment no one moved. Not Brian, not Ashley, and not the moose. The air felt thick with tension, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. Suddenly the moose snorted, a loud, guttural sound that made Ashley jump in her seat. It lowered its head, pawing at the ground with one massive hoof, sending dirt flying into the air. "Brian, it's not happy," Ashley said, her voice tight with fear. Brian shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." The moose snorted again, this time louder, more aggressive. Its ears flattened against its head, and it stomped its hoof once more. The animal was getting agitated. "We need to get out of here," Ashley urged, her heart pounding now. Brian nodded, his eyes still fixed on the moose. "Okay, I'm going to back us up slowly. Don't make any sudden movements." But as he shifted the razor into reverse and began to ease off the brake, the moose took a sudden step forward, its antlers swinging threateningly. Ashley gasped, gripping the roll bar tightly as the animal's enormous presence seemed to fill the trail. "Go, Brian!" she shouted. He floored the gas, the razor jerking backward as it tried to gain traction on the uneven ground. The moose charged forward, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Brian swerved, trying to navigate around the rocks and trees that lined the trail, but the moose was faster. It lunged forward, slamming its massive rack into the front of the razor with a deafening crash. The entire vehicle shook from the impact, and Ashley screamed as the animal's antlers raked across the hood, leaving deep gouges in the metal. "Go! Go! Go!" she yelled, her voice high with panic. Brian reversed as fast as he could, but the moose was relentless. It chased after them, its massive hooves pounding the ground like thunder. "We can't turn around here," Brian shouted, his voice strained with effort. "There's no room." The trail was too narrow, the trees too close together. They were trapped. Ashley's mind raced. What do we do? Brian's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. "I don't know. Just hold on." Suddenly, the razor hit something hard, bouncing sideways and jerking to a stop. The back wheel spun uselessly in the dirt, and Ashley felt her stomach drop. "We're stuck!" Brian cried, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. The moose was on them in an instant, slamming its hooves into the side of the razor, inches from Ashley's seat. Ashley screamed as the vehicle rocked violently, the metal frame groaning under the force of the impact. She unbuckled her seatbelt, scrambling over Brian to get out. "Get out, Brian!" she shouted, as he winced at the weight of her on top of him. But as they tumbled out of the vehicle and ran for cover, the moose kept coming. Its eyes were wild with fury, its breath steaming in the cold air. They dove behind a thick tree trunk, panting and trembling with fear. "Why isn't it stopping?" Ashley gasped, her voice shaking. Brian didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. The moose had come around the razor and rammed its antlers into the tree they used for cover, shaking the ground beneath them. "We can't stay here," Brian shouted. They darted from one tree to the next, the moose pursuing them with terrifying speed. Just when Ashley thought they were done for, a deafening roar echoed through the trees. A grizzly bear. They never saw where it came from. Its massive form stood up on two legs, dwarfing even the moose. The two animals squared off, then in an instant collided in a fury of raw power, hooves and claws slashing, echoing through the stillness of the forest like thunder. Ashley and Brian froze, both panting, eyes wide with disbelief as the two massive animals engaged in a deadly struggle. The bear latched onto the moose's hind leg, its jaws clamping down with ferocity, while the bull moose let out a deep bellow, using its massive antlers to swing and swat at the bear's head. "Now," Brian hissed, grabbing Ashley's arm, "get back in." The moose and bear were still locked in battle, but it wasn't going to last long. Without another word, Ashley scrambled into the razor, sliding back into the passenger seat. Brian followed suit, jamming the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. The vehicle rocked as he threw it into reverse, then forward, desperately trying to free it from where it had been stuck. The tires spun, kicking up dirt and water, but the razor didn't budge. Come on," Brian growled, his hands shaking as he shifted gears again, rocking the machine back and forth. The razor lurched, then rocked backward, as if on the verge of breaking free. Ashley glanced behind them. The bear was still clamped onto the moose's leg, but the animal was weakening. Blood was flowing from the gash in its hind leg, and the moose staggered, barely able to defend itself against the onslaught of the bear's powerful claws. Brian rocked the razor one last time, and finally, with a sickening groan, the tires caught traction. The vehicle shot forward, jolting them both in their seats. The moose and bear were still behind them, lost in their life and death battle. "We can't go back," Ashley shouted, her voice high with panic. "I know," Brian shouted back, gunning the engine as they tore up the narrow trail ahead. "There's no turning around now." The trail was steep and winding, the rocky terrain making it impossible to go fast. The adrenaline coursing through Ashley's veins made her heart pound as she clung to the roll bar. Brian's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the trail ahead and the rearview mirror, where the fight was slowly disappearing behind them. The trail opened up slightly, giving them a brief reprieve from the trees crowding in. But up ahead, something glistened in the fading light. "A stream!" Ashley cried, her stomach knotting with dread. The stream cut across the trail, wider and deeper than anything they'd seen so far. The water rushed past with alarming speed, the current clearly strong. Crossing it was risky, especially with a damaged razor, but they had no choice. Behind them was only death. Brian didn't hesitate. "Hang on," he shouted, flooring the gas as they sped toward the water. The razor's big tires hit the stream with a splash, and immediately Ashley felt the vehicle lurch as the water pushed against it. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, and as they crossed into the deeper part of the stream, the tires lost traction. The razor bobbed slightly, its large, knobby tires making it surprisingly buoyant, causing the razor to float just above the riverbed. The current started to twist them slightly sideways. "Brian, we're going to tip," Ashley screamed, her voice catching in her throat. "Not if I can help it." Brian gritted his teeth, gunning the engine again, trying to force the razor back into a straight line. But the vehicle was fighting against the water, the tires spinning, throwing water everywhere as the current pushed them further off course. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Ashley thought they were going to be swept downstream. But then the tires caught something beneath the surface, a submerged rock or the riverbed itself, and the razor lurched forward again. Brian slammed his foot on the gas, and the razor surged ahead, just barely making it to the other side of the stream. Ashley exhaled a shaky breath, her fingers digging into the seat as they hit solid ground again. Brian paused for a moment, the razor gurgling at idle, water spilling out of every crevice. They looked at each other, and for a moment it seemed they had made it. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, the moose crashed into the back of the razor with a bone-jarring impact. Its massive antlers slammed against the metal roll cage, creating a deafening clang that echoed through the trees. The force was so violent it sent the vehicle lurching forward, tipping it violently to the side. Brian and Ashley were thrown from their seats, their bodies flung like rag dolls as the razor flipped onto the driver's side. Brian landed beneath the wreckage, his body pinned by the weight of the machine. For Ashley, everything became a blur as she slammed into the hard earth, pain exploding through her side. The world spun wildly around her, but the shock dulled everything, leaving her barely able to comprehend the chaos unfolding around her. Then panic. "Brian!" she screamed, scrambling to her feet, her heart racing. Brian groaned in pain, his face twisted in agony as he tried to free himself, but it was no use. His leg was trapped. "Brian!" Ashley cried again, rushing over to him, her hands shaking as she tried to pull him free. "I'm pinned," Brian gasped, his face pale with pain. "I can't move." Ashley's eyes darted around wildly. The moose stood just a few feet away, its chest heaving, its massive antlers splattered with dirt and blood. It snorted, steam rising from its nostrils, head lowered as it prepared for its next move. But then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the moose lifted its head, its ears twitching, as if hearing something in the distance. For a moment it just stood there, the wild fury gone from its eyes. Then, without warning, the moose turned, lumbering back into the woods, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. Ashley stared after it, stunned, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But there was no time to process what had just happened. Brian's low, pained groan snapped her back to the present. Ashley dropped to her knees beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. His breathing was shallow, and the grimace on his face told her everything she needed to know. He was seriously hurt. "Brian, I don't know what to do," she cried, her hands trembling as she tried in vain to lift the razor off him. It was far too heavy for her to move alone. "You'll have to use the winch," Brian muttered through clenched teeth, his face tight with pain. "We've got one on the front. You'll have to pull the razor off me." Ashley's mind raced. She knew how to use the winch in theory, but she'd never had to rely on it in a life-or-death situation. Still, there was no other choice. "I can do this," she whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. She ran to the front of the razor, fumbling with the winch controls. Her fingers were slick with sweat, but she managed to pull the cable free and wrap it around a sturdy nearby tree. "Okay, what next?" she called over to Brian, her voice shaking. "Secure it to the tree," Brian wheezed. "Then use the controls to lift the razor. Be careful, the angle might shift." Ashley nodded, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She attached the cable, then scrambled back to the winch control panel. Her heart hammered as she pressed the button, and the winch slowly began pulling the razor upward. The machine groaned and creaked as it shifted, but it was working. The razor began to lift off Brian, and she could see him starting to inch his leg free. "Hold on, Brian, I'm almost there," she shouted. Brian let out a pained groan as the weight on his leg slowly eased. What felt like an eternity passed before his body finally slid free from beneath the vehicle. He collapsed onto his back, gasping for breath, his face twisted in agony. The razor creaked and groaned as its frame and plastic body scraped against the dirt, then awkwardly creaking as it bounced slightly, coming back over onto all four wheels. Ashley rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Brian, are you okay?" His leg was clearly broken, twisted at an unnatural angle, but he nodded weakly. "I'll live for now. We need to get out of here before it comes back." Ashley wiped her tears, trying to steady her hands. "I'll drive," she said, determination taking over. She carefully helped Brian into the passenger seat, his face pale with the strain. His leg hung awkwardly, but there was no time to dwell on it. They needed to move. Ashley climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. Her hands were shaking, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened, but she couldn't let fear control her. They had to get out of there. She started the Razor and pulled away slowly at first, the vehicle groaning in protest but moving. She navigated around the rocks and trees, doing her best to avoid jarring Brian too much. "Where are we even going?" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Brian gritted his teeth. "I don't know, I just—" He stopped himself, realizing they had no clear plan. The trail ahead was unfamiliar, and they were heading in the wrong direction, away from the marked trails they had started out on. The wilderness was swallowing them up. Ashley pulled the Razor over to the side of the trail and looked over at Brian, her voice shaky. "We need to figure out where we are. You're hurt. We can't just keep going aimlessly." Brian fumbled with the map, unfolding it with trembling hands. He traced the lines, shaking his head. "Damn it," he muttered. "This doesn't lead anywhere." Ashley's heart sank. "What do we do?" "We have to double back," Brian said, his voice low. "We'll never get out this way." She glanced toward the trail behind them, her stomach churning. They had to go back, closer to where the moose and bear had been fighting. The thought made her sick with dread. "Okay," she whispered, "but that means crossing the stream again. We barely made it last time." "We have no choice," Brian groaned. "Just go." Ashley nodded, steeling herself. She revved the engine and turned the Razor around, heading back toward the stream. The sky was darker now, the shadows growing longer, and every flicker of movement in the trees sent her heart racing. They had to move fast. The stream came into view, its current stronger than before. The water churned ominously, and she could feel Brian tensing beside her. "Just keep steady," he said through gritted teeth. "We can make it." Ashley took a deep breath and gunned the engine. The Razor plunged into the stream, the tires fighting against the current. The vehicle bobbed slightly, the big tires lifting just enough to make traction a struggle. The current twisted them sideways, threatening to pull them downstream. Come on," Ashley muttered, gripping the wheel tighter as she tried to keep the Razor from tipping. Water splashed over the sides, and she could feel the panic rising in her chest. "Gun it!" Brian urged, his face contorted with pain. She did, and the Razor surged forward, just barely clearing the other side of the stream. They hit solid ground again, but Ashley's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She glanced at the darkening forest around them, her instinct screaming that something was wrong. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement in the trees, just a flicker. Her pulse quickened. "Brian, I think something's out there," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Brian winced, barely able to open his eyes. "Just go." Ashley nodded, her veins pulsing with adrenaline. She wanted to push the Razor faster, her mind spinning with anxiety over what might be lurking just beyond the tree line. But the trail was unforgiving, each bump and jolt sending fresh waves of pain through Brian's body. He groaned in agony, but his voice was firm as he urged her forward. "Faster," he grunted through clenched teeth. "Keep going." Gritting her own teeth, Ashley pressed harder on the gas, pushing the machine harder. As they rounded a sharp bend, the tires suddenly hit a patch of loose dirt. The Razor skidded out of control, and despite Ashley's desperate attempt to correct it, the vehicle veered sideways. Before she could react, the Razor slammed violently into a tree on Brian's side with a bone-rattling crunch. "Brian!" Ashley screamed, the world spinning around her. Brian's head whipped forward, then back, colliding with the tree. Blood spilled down his face as his body went limp. "No, no, no!" she cried, reaching for him, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Brian, please!" His eyes were half closed, his face pale and bloodied. He didn't move. Ashley's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at him, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Tears blurred her vision, and for a moment she couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. Then she heard it. A subtle crunch of leaves, a huff, barely discernible through her shock. Instinctively, her head snapped to the left. All she saw was the wide open mouth of the grizzly bear, inches away, and then everything went black. In nature's domain, violence isn't cruel, it's just the way of things. Here the wild claims what it's owed, and man is only passing through.